growing up in the South. Certainly that pervades your work. Just tell me a little bit about where you grew up.
So I grew up in Mobile. I'm a Gulf Coast girl. So my earliest years were on a houseboat, on a 38-foot houseboat called the Bare Necessities. My parents got divorced. I actually found like what my mother had typed out what she wanted in the divorce. It was like number one, Elizabeth. Number two, the house. So she sold the house and bought this 38-foot houseboat from a couple that had retired and purchased this boat and decided they were going to float down the Mississippi, and they got like halfway down the Mississippi and Hurricane Frederick hit and they got stranded in the middle of the Mississippi. So by the time they got rescued off the sandbar, they never wanted to be on a boat again. And so my mom bought this boat for like next to nothing, and in just a sort of like crazy leap of faith moment, decided to move her 3-year-old onto the houseboat. So most of my early childhood was spent I had a ski belt that I had to wear anytime I was like not inside, but if I was on deck. So I sort of joke that any body image issues that I might have goes back to like, carrying around this ski belt around my waist. But, it was this really eclectic childhood. My parents were divorced, and so I went to my dad's on the weekends, and I was with him every day, every week from Friday afternoon until 5:30 Saturday. Like, I don't know how they came up with 5:30 Saturday, but that was when he brought me back. And they had a really, I think, for the most part, amicable, low-key divorce. So he usually, would come and pick me up and stuff. So I had a good relationship with both of my parents. The boat years, I have really strong memories despite being really young. So we lived on that houseboat from the time I was 3 until I was 7. We always sort of joke that we moved off the boat because I could no longer sit up in the top bunk because there were bunk beds in the back, and my mom had the bottom bunk and I had the top bunk. So, it was kind of a cool and different way. And there were all of these characters who were always on the boat, and my mom would have these parties on the boat. And so I have really vivid memories of like all of these really kind of interesting, colorful people coming in and out of on and off our boat. And then we moved from there into the house that my mom grew up in. So it was weird because like my mom lived in the house that she grew up in, and my dad lived in the house that he grew up
Mm.
in. And my grandparents were a big part of my life. My grandmother on my mother's side was just an integral part of my childhood. She died in 2023 at the age of 108.
Wow.
So, and then my grandparents on my dad's side lived on the same piece of property as my dad's house. So, Saturday mornings I would run over to their house and make biscuits with my grandmother and watch cartoons and quilt. She taught me how to quilt at a very young age. So, there there was a lot of chaos in a lot of ways and instability, and yet I think both sets of grandparents really offered a lot of
Mm.
grounding and stability. They were just always there, so they were a big part of that childhood.
Do you remember when like theater came into your life?
Oh, 100%. I can tell you exactly when a theater came into my life. I went to see the movie version of A Chorus Line. I didn't know it was a
Hmm.
play. My mom took me much like the character in A Chorus Line, like, she didn't have a babysitter, so she took me to see it. She drugged me with her just like the girl, in At the Ballet. And, probably a little inappropriate for 8 years old, but I remember being drawn to the sense of community and
Yeah.
family. That's what was my takeaway from that show. And I'd always kind of been a ham. I'm an only kid. I'd always loved to get up and sing in front of people. Not that I was any good, but I always wondered, like, how do those kids get on those
Right.
commercials, right? But seeing that, and then I remember in 4th grade, so we went home that summer, and I told my mom, that I wanted to get enrolled in acting classes at our local children's theater, and that was really what started all of it. So, and I wrote a short story in 4th grade about this producer who was gonna turn the movie into a Broadway show. I had no idea it already was a Broadway show. And so, in the story, we audition, and then all the kids who don't get cast were all the kids that I didn't like from the children's theater. And so that was really what started it all was seeing a chorus line and wanting some part of what
What
they
they were doing.
had. And so, yeah, I started doing children's theater in Mobile and did it all the way until I left home, doing children's theater and then, sort of transitioning into adult community theater. And starting in, I guess, 8th grade, I started going away in the summers and doing summer programs elsewhere. Like I did a program in New York, I did a program at North Carolina School of the Arts, I did a program at the Hampton Playhouse in New Hampshire. And those were just really amazing experiences. But really, I think the experience that really solidified everything for me was I got cast in Peter Pan at the Alabama Shakespeare Festival when I was 15. My mother later admitted that she only let me audition because she never thought there was a chance I'd get cast. Like I was a chesty 15-year-old girl who didn't really sing or dance, but she drove me to Montgomery to audition and I got a call back and then I got cast. And my grandmother, God love her, moved to Montgomery
Wow.
with me for 10 weeks, and I remember taking money at my mom having to take money out of savings to pay for the, like, furnished apartment we were in, because I wasn't local, I wasn't equity. They were like, "We wanna cast you, but we can't house you." And, that community of actors gave me what I think I saw at 8 years old in a chorus
Mm.
line. Because I think so many kids, when they think about being an actor, they think, "I wanna be a star." And doing that show taught me a lot about what it meant to be a working actor. And all of those actors just really embraced me. They were so generous. One of those actors walked me down the aisle when I got married. And so they're all still, a part of my life. And then of course the Alabama Shakespeare Festival has been my creative home, really ever since. And I feel like all roads in my life lead back to that experience. And what a leap of faith my mom took by like letting me audition for this thing that felt so ridiculous and then making it happen for
It's a real
me.
moment. Like it's a real moment of kind of transition.
Yeah.
When you went to New York, so when you
Hmm.
decided to go to college for theater, how'd that go?
Hmm.
Was the experience?
So when I left the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, I didn't make the transition back into high school very well, because I had this taste of like what I wanted to do and like high school parties and all that just felt so dumb.
And no high school, in your high school.
I did theater. Actually, my high school drama teacher was my date for opening night of Zelda
Oh, that's
last
awesome.
year. It was really wonderful, and she's become a dear friend and mentor and sort of surrogate mom at times. So it was really wonderful to be able to share that with her. But I did theater in high school, but we didn't have a very big program. We didn't have a lot, well, we didn't have a lot of money in our program. And and I don't know, I was just in a weird place. Like I just feel like I was kind of floundering socially. I was floundering academically, I was like definitely qualified as like the gifted kid who was not living up to their potential. So I was just kind of phoning it in. And again, like my mom in this like amazing leap of faith realized that something had to change. And so I went to her and I said I wanted to withdraw from the big public high school and I found this like homeschool program before like homeschool was really a thing that was run out of a church in Theodore, Alabama, run by Miss Cindy, who had like been a biker with the Hells Angels. And my mom was like, "You can do it, but you have to pay your own tuition." And so I worked at this yogurt shop and I did voiceovers and I babysat and I paid my own tuition and they let me work at my own pace. And so I did basically 2 years of high school in six
Mm.
months. And then I was like, I'm out. And again, like this huge leap of faith. My mom said, like, if you can just graduate from high school, you can move to New York. And so I held up my end of the bargain and she held up her end of the bargain and I moved to New York. Yeah, like a month before my 16th my 17th birthday. So I was 16 years old. And I was really fortunate because there was a guy named Roger McFarlane, who at the time was the executive director of Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS. And his aunt and my grandmother were volunteers together at Little Sisters of the Poor. And he was in town, like, visiting family, and my grandmother's like, "Miss Kitty wants you to meet her nephew who's kinda involved in the theater," you know? And I'm like, "What kinda, like, washed up has-been am I gonna have to go, like, meet to make my grandmother happy?" And it was just sort of one of those really sort of fortuitous moments. And, Roger gave me his card, and he said, "Call me when you get to New York," and I have to say, like, I was so tenacious at that time, like, if you told me to call, like, I called. And he took me under his wing, and, like, within my first week in New York, I was at cocktail parties at the Central Park Boathouse, and I was at dinner with Larry Kramer, and again, it was just this really pivotal moment and a wonderful introduction into New York, and, I lived at this women's residency down on 13th Street that was run by the Salvation Army. So anytime someone called, like, they would say, "Salvation Army, Markle Evangeline Residence for Women." So it sounded like I was living in a women's shelter, but it was kind of perfect because I was still a minor, and they fed you 2 meals a day as part of your rent, and they changed your linens once a week, and no men allowed past the first floor unless they were over 60, because,
Guess you know.
60-year-old men are never predatory. And and again, it was just this sort of, like, wild experience there, and I got a job as a Broadway usherette, which for a little theater kid, it was like a dream, and so I would sub around to all these different theaters, and I had that job off and on for, like, years, years and years and years. And, and I learned so much about the theater that way. Like, I loved working plays when they were in previews because you could see how they changed,
Mhm.
working up to opening night, and the writers would be in the back of the house, and I would show up early so I could just kind of stand back there and watch them and listen to those conversations. So, I remember sitting in the back of the house with Arthur Miller. I remember walking down into the lounge where the usher's room was, and, like, there was James Lapine and Stephen Sondheim rehearsing an actor at a rehearsal piano. So, just a lot of really amazing experiences that, you can't plan in any
That's, like,
way.
amazing, and at that age too. It's like
Yeah. Yeah. The fact that my mom was willing to let me take that risk too. And I was kind of a rule follower. I wasn't, I didn't drink. I wasn't a partier. I knew that if I screwed up, I'd have to go
yeah.
home. And that was like the last thing I wanted to do. And it wasn't home as in, like, I didn't want to go home to my mom. My mom and I had a great relationship, but I just didn't fit. I was just in a place where I didn't
Yeah.
fit.
Now acting has come in here a bunch, so what how did that diverge? Has it diverged? Do you still act? Do you yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah. Yeah, no, I think I realized very early on that I wanted to be an actor more than I wanted to do the work necessary to be a good
Mhm.
actor. And probably more people need to have that realization earlier in their lives and careers. So, I was in New York and I was auditioning for things, and, I got my equity card, and, I screen tested for a couple of movies, but I just sort of didn't land a lot of stuff, and I hated going to acting class, and I also couldn't figure out, like, how do you pay for acting class and rent and work, and, like, it just anyway. But I started writing, and I had always been like the kid who wrote skits for school and monologues for myself, and I went to see the Young Playwrights Festival at the Public Theater, and I remember Madeline George had a play called The Most Massive Woman Wins. And, growing up, I read a lot of plays when I was in high school, but I only read the plays that were available at our public library. So they, like, had all of Tennessee Williams, all of Eugene O'Neill, and all of Neil Simon, and that was it. And so, like, in my mind, like, only, like, old white guys wrote plays. And so sitting in that theater and seeing this girl who was, like, my age writing this play that I remember thinking, "Oh, this resonates," but also, like, I could have written that. And it just so happened that Wendy Wasserstein was there that day. And I, like, accosted her in the lobby of the public theater and, like, vomited out all of this, like, youthful enthusiasm. And she said, "Well, I think you should go home and write a play." And I remember thinking, well, Wendy Wasserstein thinks I should write a play. I should go home and write a play. But I didn't know anything about writing a play, so I had a copy of The Sisters Rosenzweig, which was on Broadway at the time, and I basically, like, outlined the structure of that
Mhm.
play, and I just sort of, like, dropped in my own scenes, And I wrote a short play and I submitted it to the Young Playwrights Festival and it didn't get selected, but I kept doing it. And I would go and usher at night. And as soon as the show started, I would sit on the steps of the theater and I would, write my plays or revise my plays. And then I remember I would hide my script during intermission in the firebox, so like with the fire extinguisher, and then I'd go get it and sit down and write again. So so that was sort of how it got started, and I wasn't willing to do the work necessary to be a better actor, but I was always willing to do the work necessary to be a better writer. And I wrote this one-act play and submitted it to the Blackjack Festival of New Plays at Cap 21, and it got selected. And suddenly I was in this room with like this Tony-nominated actor that I had seen on the Tony Awards as a kid, and these two kids who had, were Broadway kids were doing my show. And the first time I heard the audience laugh, like I was done. I was like, I'm in.
Yeah.
Let's do
Yeah.
this. You got me. And it was just, yeah, again, it was just like another really pivotal moment. I remember being in rehearsal and this actress, Evelyn Barron, asking like, but I don't know what the conflict in this play is. And it was the first time I'd really heard that word. And I'm like, oh, like a play needs conflict. Yeah, like, and I went home and like rewrote the play. And yeah, so just sort of, again, like this magical moment.
Yeah. And you like New York. So why'd you leave?
So I'd been in New York for a really long time. I was there for September 11th. I think I was supposed to be in the Trade Center
Goodness.
that day thing, and I got sent to a different office. So that was like my near-death experience that was like, so what am I doing with my life? And so I applied to grad school at NYU and did the grad program there, which was just really great. But I kind of at that point was getting a little antsy. I'd been a member of Youngblood
Hmm.
at the Ensemble Student Theater, which is their incubator for writers under 30. But I was curious about, film and television, specifically television. So that's what I did my thesis in at NYU. So I was in New York for 11 years, 13 years, kind of depending on how you count it. And then I went to LA and, had my TV experience. Oddly enough, the show that I got staffed on shot in New York. So I like went
Good.
back to New York, to LA to get a job in New York. With that happens sometimes. But the big thing was I got staffed on this show and it was like this dream come true. But I was really struggling in the writer's room. And then my mom got diagnosed with bile duct cancer, which, like 1,000 people a year get diagnosed with bile duct cancer. There are no walks, there are no ribbons. And so it was also really hard to be in the writer's room knowing that she was
Hmm.
sick. And, I'm an only child. My mom's an only child. My kid is an only child. So I had this play that was done at the Royal Court in London. Then I
Was that
got
White Lightning? Was that
no, that was
Fresh
Fresh
Gills?
Hills.
Okay.
Hills, which was the show that Matt Smith got his equity card on, true
Hmm.
story, if you watch any of Doctor Who. But yeah, the show got canceled and sort of simultaneously one of my plays got picked up for production at Alabama Shakes. And the play was a big hit and I had all of these productions. And the writer's strike was happening in New York, in
Sounds
Los Angeles. So it was like my show gets canceled, my other play gets picked up, the writer's strike is happening, my mom dies. And I just had this moment where I knew that for at least a year I could afford to just be a
hmm
playwright. And so I took this huge leap of faith and I moved back to Mobile. I bought a house because I just needed a home. And and again, it's just like another one of those leaps of faith that, I don't know what gave me the courage to do that. And it gave me a chance to be closer to my grandmother, who I was really close to. But, I think losing my mom just kind of,
Changed everything.
it a
Yeah.
lot of things into perspective, you know? And I also knew that like as soon as the writer's strike was over, I was like, no one's going to hire me because they're going to be all of these really experienced writers with like mortgages and kids in private school who are going to be willing to work for a lot less money. And that's really that's what happened. So it wasn't necessarily a bad decision. I think the unfortunate thing is like kind of once you leave LA, it's hard to go back to LA. And if I did that now, I'd have to really start
Yeah.
over. But, and I moved back to Mobile and I met my ex-husband and got married and had a kid 10 months later, 12, 11 months later, something like that. I guess it was 11 months later. And then, my marriage fell apart and then that's how I ended up in Swanee,
Hmm.
Tennessee.
How
Uh,
old's your child now?
she's
Nice.
14, which is also kind of
It's
bananas to think about that
bananas.
14-year-old.
Yeah. I don't think anything has for us like running the theater company here. We have five, so it's like yeah.
Yeah, you can believe like theater people had 5 children.
After two, it doesn't matter. After it just gets you just throw them in the mix.
You just throw
Um,
you just throw Oreos at them
yeah,
or Cheerios
but it
at
really
them.
does change, just like everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And, and Swanee has been a really wonderful place to raise a
mhm,
kid. It's been a good place to be a single parent because there's just a huge sense of community here. Everyone's on this mountain together. Like you just kind of have to like make friends and figure it
mhm,
out. And so, and I think my daughter's had a lot of freedoms that she wouldn't have had if she were in New York or, even in downtown Mobile in the historic district of Mobile, which is where we were before. So she's been able to free range since she was like
mhm.
10. So it's certainly not where I thought I would be 20 years ago, but I think it's sort of right where I'm supposed to be right
That's
now.
awesome. And teaching, what do you enjoy most about teaching?
I love watching kids fall in love with the
Mm.
form, especially watching kids who come in maybe hesitant or a little scared of it, realize that they can do it. I love watching students take risks in their work. I love watching that sense of growth. But really the most redeeming thing is when you watch a kid go off and start having success. Because it really feels like a weird extension of your own success. Not to take ownership over that, but it always serves as an affirmation. And so that's what I've loved most about it. And I love it when kids come and talk to me about really important things and I like being able to be that person in their life. I'm actually teaching at the Young Swanee Writers Conference right now. So I've got all these high school kids and it's just been fun to see what's on their
Yeah,
mind and
kind of bring you right back around.
it really
Yeah,
does. It really does. I think a lot of times people don't want to do like the high school workshops. And I was talking about this with some of the other faculty here today who are teaching, that we've got poetry, fiction, and playwriting and songwriting happening right now. And, we were talking about like sometimes people don't want to go teach the high school. There's like a hierarchy there or something. But, if we don't help them fall in love with it now, where do those forms go, right? Like we have to keep inspiring and supporting the younger generation or it just dies out. I think that's one reason why we have to support regional theaters. That's I love the work that you guys are doing at Pure. Broadway's awesome. Like, and of course as a writer, like sure, I'd love a show on Broadway, but it's in the regional theaters where people fall in love with the
mm,
theater. And everyone who ends up on Broadway started out going to theater in their hometown. And so, I have a real commitment to
that's
that.
awesome. Definitely want to get
Yeah.
to Zelda in the Backyard in just a second, but I also want to talk a little bit about Charleston. How familiar were you with Charleston before
Not
eighth
at
grade?
all. Not at all. I've actually never been to Charleston, which is bananas to me because I've traveled all over the
Yeah.
South and somehow I've never been to Charleston. I have this, I think, probably the romanticized vision of of Charleston that I think a lot of people have. And I think that Charleston has sort of worked
It
hard to
it
cultivate to
has
a
its
certain extent.
moments for sure.
It has
Yeah.
its moment. But I know it's one of Mobile's sister
Yes.
cities. No, the landscape of it feels very
Yeah.
familiar to
Well,
me. We also have the same heat and humidity.
exactly. Well,
So
we're getting storms coming this week too. So, and then going to like the state of the South because I'm everybody here knows David Lee because we did a bunch of his plays. Amazing
Mhm.
artist, amazing human being. Um, and I remember when he went out on that, but I didn't get to hear much about it.
So this was another one of those like transformative experiences in my life where I just felt really, I was really grateful to be invited, not a seat at the table, a seat in the
Hmm.
van with these amazing artists. So we had a Di Moon, Danetta Grays,
Right.
who's another South Carolina girl, David and myself, along with Rick Dildine, who was the artistic director at the time. And we also took a videographer with
Mhm.
us and documented the whole experience. And so, we did 12 cities in 10 days touring the sort of the Southeast. And we were hosting about the changing face of Southern identity, right? Who is the South? What is the South? Where is the South? And it was really amazing to walk into these communities and also see who showed up. People were eager to have these conversations. And we did some training beforehand on moderation and de-escalation in case things got, too heated. But we also, after a couple of stops, really started to gel together. So I feel like we all kind of had the questions that we asked in the moment. Every city had its own kind of vibe, but we got to see sort of how the history in the South, like everyone walked into that room carrying some of that history with them. But we were also really, really interested, in terms of like the changing face of Southern identity. It's such a more diverse place than it was even when I was a kid. So seeing how people who are coming from other cultures and other countries are assimilating or not assimilating into the South and how they identify, do you identify as a Southerner if you are not, you know, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation Southerner? So it was really wonderful to be a part of those conversations. But the other great thing was we would get back in the van and it was wonderful to hear everyone else talk about what they heard and how they responded to what was being said. We drove like 2,400 miles in 10 days, and I drove, I think, 22 of those 2,400 miles.
I saw you driving it in the, and we'll put links to the video. And but yeah, you seemed like you were driving a lot.
I drove almost all of it, and a part of it has to do with the fact that I get horribly car sick. So, but it also just I don't know. It was kind of a great position to be in because I could really just listen. And and we had people in the van who were also coming in with different lived experiences. And so, it was really educational for me personally.
Yeah.
So I really love being part of that project. It's one of the projects I'm most proud
Mhm.
of.
In talking about Zelda in the Backyard, we're very excited about it. We're very, very excited about doing
I'm
it.
so
I'm going to
excited
go
you guys are
talk
doing
to
it.
those guys a little later tonight. We've talked a lot about memory. We talked a lot about like memory, and I'm always fascinated how memory makes its way into your work, even if it really is creative.
Mhm.
If you apply that somehow in thought, how would you describe Zelda?
It's definitely a memory piece. I think it's also in some ways a love letter to my dad. He died when I was 11, and so much of my work in ways that I don't think I was intentional about often when I was writing it has tied to my dad, really to both my parents and the loss of both of them. Loss is something that I think runs through most of my work, and this idea of legacy and what we leave behind. And so, my dad died and didn't have a lot to leave behind. Not a lot of possessions. He had this 1961 Rolls Royce, but no bank accounts. There were all of these paradoxes when it came to my dad. But he left me these stories and these memories, and it was really a way for me to tell those stories and I think one thing that's always tricky when you're writing something that's autobiographical is you never want to feel like it's a therapy piece. Like you don't want to but I think I worked through all my stuff, right? Like, and because I worked through all my stuff, then I was able to be in a place where I could write it and write it objectively, because I think it's also easy to romanticize people who aren't there anymore.
Hmm.
So it was important for me to write about this experience, but not completely let him off the hook either. So, so you do see his flaws, in the storytelling to a certain extent. But it was, I also purposely gave the character a different name than my name. And part of that was a way for me to create a little bit of separation between myself and the character on stage. When we did the original production, we had Nancy Bell, who's just this amazing actor. And when we came in to start rehearsing, again, it was like one of those, my mother would call it a God moment. This person showed up and we had all of these interesting parallels in our own
Hmm.
lives. So much of the story resonated with her in different ways as well. But it was important to me that she never felt like she had to play me,
Right.
right? Like you don't have to be Elizabeth. And so that was really, and she never, I think, she told me that she never felt like she had to be me. And I wanted to make sure that I wrote a piece that anyone could pick up and find their own way to connect with and make it their own. So I never wanted that to sort of loom over it. And a lot of people asked, like, are you going to perform the piece? Because, usually when people write solo work, they write it for themselves. And I think maybe there'll be a time and a place for me to do that. I'm not opposed to it. And I think it would actually be kind of fun and interesting to do. But I think also with a new piece of work, because I'm not necessarily a performer, I felt like I needed I needed to just be the
Hmm.
playwright. Now that the play sort of is what it is, maybe I could step into it and do the show. But yeah, so I never felt like I was writing it because I needed to perform
Right.
it. Simply, it was my right way of telling the
Right.
story.
Do you find it when you see it? How does it is it difficult or not difficult at all?
Um, you know, I remember the first day of tech, as soon as the house music faded and the opening music began to play, like I immediately burst into
Yeah.
tears. And some of that was knowing that the story that was about to be told. Some of it was just, I think, the sense of relief that we have when we've gone through this
Hmm.
process, because it's such a long process and we write things and we never know if anyone's ever going to see them. And just really an overwhelming sense of gratitude to ASF for embracing the play and for them, it was a bit of a risk for them to do a show that had, some LGBTQ themes in it. So I was just really overwhelmed with emotion. There are moments in the play that do still sort of hit me here and there. But again, like I feel like I've spent a lot of hours in therapy, and I think I'm just at a different place in my
Yeah.
life, so I can step back from that. I did have an interesting moment the weekend the show opened. We were doing a panel discussion about the show, and these two women walked into the patrons lounge at ASF, and there was just something in my gut that was like, these women don't belong here. Like they just didn't look like ASF
Mm.
patrons. I mean, they were nicely dressed and they sat in the front row. And as I walked up to take my seat, this woman just like stuck out this manila envelope and says, "This is for you, Elizabeth." And I immediately was like, these are my relatives. I just knew it. And they never said it. They didn't say anything. They didn't introduce themselves. So I'm sitting there through this whole talk back with this envelope in my lap and not knowing what's inside of it and not knowing why these women were there. And so I grabbed Madeline Lambert, who was the artistic associate at the time, and was like, you've got to sit with me while I open this envelope. And so I opened it, and it was all these pictures of my dad, but they were pictures of my dad as a kid. And I literally don't have a single picture of my dad before the age of
Wow.
18 until she handed me this package of this envelope of photographs. And so she ended up coming back by and she said, I just want to introduce myself. I'm your dad's second cousin. And I like vaguely remembered them from my childhood. And so, she and her sister, or maybe it was another cousin, I don't even know. It was all sort of a blur, went to see the show. And it just so happened, without Nancy, our actress, knowing it, there's a lot of audience participation in the show. She had given her the hope chest to hold on to.
Wow.
And so, but I didn't know I knew she knew my dad, but I didn't know if she knew this story. And so that, I had not planned to watch the show that day, but I wanted to go in and I watched them watch the show. And it was interesting. They were really invested in it, and they stayed through the whole thing. And, I had this vision of them like storming out at some point, but they didn't. They stayed. And so that was a really neat experience, to have that moment. And, I didn't talk to them afterward, honestly, because I kind of hid. But, they were willing to hear
That's
that
amazing.
story.
What are you working on now? What's next?
So I think we're in a really interesting time politically, creatively, in terms of like the theater landscape right now. And so I think it's been really hard for me to figure out like, what are the stories I need to be telling right now? I think a lot of the conversations around identity politics have also made me really think about what stories can I tell or should I tell? I just finished a play this fall that still doesn't have a title. I'm calling it the Untitled Measure for Measure
Nice.
Project, which is about an aging Supreme Court justice who stages a mock trial of Shakespeare's Measure for Measure, and how that story parallels Case Before the Court. There are all of these other things sort of intertwined. And again, it's a story about legacy and like, when is it time to step away and leave it to other people? And what is the legacy that we leave behind? And I'm really proud of it. It's a bigger play than I've written before. It's got a lot more storylines woven together than a lot of the stuff I write. So it felt really daunting and ambitious, but I'm hoping to find a home for that. And then I'm working on a new draft of a play called The Improvisers, which is set in a women's improv class. And it's really kind of a story about like women and the idea. I was curious about how women engage with one another outside of motherhood, but also improvisation as like a metaphor for parenting, but also this idea of agreement and women's relationship with agreement. So hopefully by the end of the summer, I'll have a draft of that done.
That's awesome. And you're coming to see us, right?
I'm coming to see you. I've got to figure all that out. But I wouldn't miss it for
When
the
you
world.
do, you'll have to meet Camille, because Camille is an incredible improv actor. Yeah, her improv skills
awesome.
are amazing. So she's amazing. Well, we're going to look real forward to meeting you in person and during that period. Thank you so much for taking the time with us today.
Well, thanks for supporting my work. I appreciate
Absolutely.
it.
We can't wait to do it. And we will see you soon.